What are patterns? Patterns are forms which continuously repeat themselves. And we inherit form when we are born in the physical body. The biological parents pass on their genetic patterns, which is a form, and repeat it within us. But we are obviously a mixture between the father and the mother, so it is a mixture between the two. This physical pattern is something that we live with, and it is something we can change. Change takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort, and either direction or creativity. We also receive forms and patterns psychologically from our parents, which are not necessarily completely genetical. These psychological patterns are imprinted on us and informs us to repeat it. And we repeat it until we decide differently if there is a need to change it, if there is a need to make it better. Society or culture, or both, also has an imprint on us physically and psychologically with its forms and patterns and repetition, which creates our identity in relation to other people and in relation to how to survive in the world. And again, also, we repeat it insofar as it needs to be changed or it wants to be changed. And for a sense of freedom, we take a creative stance in order to create change, in order to experience novelty for new forms. And new forms do occur when they are good enough on a cultural level and are introduced in the culture and therefore they are repeated. But is this also done on the individual level? Well, yes, it is, obviously. People go through significant changes in their life when new forms are presented, and some of them are ideas, and some of them are just occurrences in one's own life that overwhelms and creates change, sometimes for the positive, sometimes for the negative, and sometimes it's just confusing. But there are certain other forms which can be acted on by volition, by one's choice. And those are the ideas that we are either presented, that we discover, or that we come up with ourselves in order to make a change for the better, hopefully. And some of these ideas, actually, I would say, come from our own soul. This soul is the part of one's own self that is infinite in nature, and that infinite nature is divided into two. The soul is the infinitely far away, and when perceived, it is perceived as one's own best possible interest, one's own best possibility, one's greatest destiny, or one's many great destinies, possible destinies. So that part of the self appears infinitely far away, not because it is infinitely far removed, but because the nature of space, the nature of the world, the nature of the cosmos, or the universe rather, is infinite in itself. But there's also an infinite part within us that is intimately bound to the soul, and that is our capacity to choose. That is our capacity to use our own volition. That is the capacity for self-agency. And that volition, choice, or spirit, as sometimes it is called, that spirit longs for itself. It longs for its soul. It longs for its power. Because really what it is, the choice to spirit, it is pure power. It is the pure potential power until it is used. Then it becomes actual power. And it wants to reconnect with its soul, which is infinitely far away. And the way that spirit connects with itself is by making decisions and by letting go. And by asking the soul, which way do I go? Or how do I perceive myself? Or what is the best possible choice right now? And the soul naturally gravitates towards the spirit in presenting those ideas and forms, whether or not the spirit is asking for it. But when the spirit asks for it, when the self, the choice, when we make the choice and we open up to our greatest possibility or possibilities, then we are more receptive to actually recognize what the soul is saying. We are more receptive to being able to hear it. And therefore, there is a conversation that is going on that sometimes manifests itself in the world as either, well, it can manifest itself in a countless amount of ways, but some of the more common ones would be synchronicities, dreams, premonitions, manifestations, and so on and so forth. And what the spirit really hungers for, what really desires, that spiritual lust or that spiritual hunger, is not first and foremost to have a power and control over the physical world. It does want that, but it only, in a deeper sense, or in the deepest sense, and I use this word deepest in a reserved, careful way, it wants that through itself. Because the physical, or I shouldn't say the physical, because everything is physical or everything is ethereal or whatever noun one wants to give it. But the finite world of forms, right, since we're talking about forms, cannot replace the potential power of the soul that the spirit longs for. And the spirit or the volition that is misguided will seek to substitute its potential best power through the physical world or the finite world of forms. It will continuously amass and gain forms, but never have a relation to the self in the most intimate way that would allow ultimately the self to relax and view the world and experience the world in its glorious infinite beauty, potentially. And so the relation of the soul to the spirit is to constantly give forms that we experience in a myriad of ways. But it's not until the spirit responds or asks for more clarity that it is able to interact with it. And when that happens, a new type of relationship obviously emerges from that specific relation between one's spirit and one's soul, meaning one's power and one's potential power, right? We have an experience of choice, which is an experience of power, and we want more power. So, in a sense, choose power. Choose the what empowers you the most, and what empowers you the most is to have an infinitely intimate relationship with that power, with that choice. And part of that infinite intimacy is to let go. It is to relax. It is to let the world speak. It is to let the self speak. In order to do that, it would help, though it's not the only way, but it would help to initiate the conversation on clear grounds. And that clear ground is up to you to create. In a sense, you could say, okay, I want what is, for instance, one could say, I want what is best for me. I'm listening. And once that groundwork is created with clarity and distinction and time and effort, some spirited sincerity, things will start to happen that will respond to that ground. Things will start to land on that ground and take form. And those forms which emerge from that ground that is built, it's like a temple, or it's like the ground or the base sort of cornerstone of a temple, so that the greatest possibilities that is inherently your power and your potential power is manifesting gently, because it has to be gentle, because you have to trust yourself. Because once you trust yourself more than anything else, then that power, that relationship with your own power begins to grow. And you start making decisions which will lead you to the ultimate power, which is to be comfortable infinitely in intimacy with your own choices and your own self. And therefore, then your relationship with the finite world or the physical world changes. It's no longer about needs and negative emotions which are, or positive, or what you think would be positive emotions that are swaying you so that you're running from point A to point B to point whatever. You are in the world, in this meditative, contemplative, complete sense. And the relationship with other people can be trustworthy, because you can trust yourself. And if you meet other people who are in a trusting relationship with themselves, one can only imagine the potential conversations that can be had, and how those two individuals would view the world together, in conversation, or in silence, or in creative banter. So, the patterns that we receive are simply vehicles that were given to us in order to exist in the world and to inform us how to survive in families, in society, and in time. And until we come to a moment when we want to make an inventory of what we've inherited and say, either this is good enough, I'm just going to continue on my merry way, sure. Or say, well, I'm going to maybe make some decisions. Then you're making an inventory of possibilities, of possible choices. So you say, well, what are my possible choices? Well, then you take a look at the world, and you look as to what it is, and you look at what you are as an individual, or as a sentient being, and you say, okay, it might not be exactly what I thought it was, but maybe I have a little bit of a better idea, or maybe I have a even more confused idea. But one thing is for sure, you can make choices. And whatever noun you want to give associated with that verb choosing, doesn't matter. That is an undividable fact that choices can be made. Or to use a different sentence, you can participate with the world. And in that sense, new forms are turned into potential patterns. When you're looking at new forms, you say, well, maybe this and maybe that. But without having necessarily anxiety to constantly have to choose. Because that would just create a new pattern that would lead into more anxiety, or more fear, or more anger. And that might happen, but it doesn't have to happen. And it definitely doesn't have to happen if you have a relationship with something that has your best interest at heart, that has your best interest inherent within it. And what would have your best interest inherent within it aside from yourself? That would be, we could call that anything under the sun we want. Call it the soul. And with that guiding factor, the anxiety, the fears, the anger is humbled. Unless we don't choose to go with that guidance, then that anxiety begins to really crank up the heat. We begin to sweat. We're like, well, I have this much better option, insofar as I understand it, but I'm not choosing it. And I'm going to go in the shade and try to get rid of some of this heat. But the sun moves, doesn't it? It keeps moving, just as the soul moves, and continuously gives direction, continuously gives forms, and gives opportunities. Basically, that's what it says. That's what it does. The spirit is in the body, or incarnated throughout the body, and to try to use a different language. And the spirit hungers. The choice hungers to be used. So the soul responds to it, because the soul and the spirit are actually one and the same. They're identical. They are the same noun, except that one is a verb and the other is a noun. When the spirit isn't making decisions, when the spirit isn't a verb, the soul becomes a verb, and the spirit becomes a noun. So the soul is moving and is speaking to the spirit, says, I am potential power. The spirit's like, huh? What? I'm what? I'm something? More than nothing? And so too, when the spirit moves, when the spirit acts, when it is a verb, the soul becomes the noun. It takes form. It appears and manifests as objects. Because the soul says, I'm being called. And I'm answering it. And I'm presenting that answer with form, with a noun of objects. And when that answer of the soul is made, the spirit, one of the possibilities is to simply let go and take a good look as to what that response is. Because, at least in the initiating process, you want to be able to go and understand with clarity, gleaming clarity, what's happening at those moments. Now, as more experience is gained, there isn't a need for such a huge contrast between passivity and activity of the self and whatnot, and the forms, and right? There's not this anxiety of of having needing results. But in the initiating stages, in the maturing phase of becoming this more mature self of the spirit and the soul, understanding the finite and infinite nature of the world, being born again, going out of the womb of the culture, or parts of the culture, of the yoke of the culture. Not to say that you can't go back in it, but being born again outside and see that the world is actually bigger. Because the self-interest of a society, the self-interest of a civilization, the self-interest of the machine of survival as a mass of individuals is different than the interest of an individual, the highest interest of the individual. Insofar as the individual absolutely needs the mass of individuals as a culture, society, whatnot, then of course that interest is there, right? Food, housing, companionship. But as certain needs are going to be replaced by yourself, your potential self, and others who do the work of that potential self, that are met outside of the mass of the culture, right, at the very center of this mass, the density. Then at the limits outside and the peripherals of that culture and society, begin to feed the individual in a new way that has to do with the emancipation of the self, in answering the soul's call towards one's greatest destinies. And as this is not work that it needs to be done by oneself, by yourself, can be done, but it doesn't have to be. And there's great pleasure in doing it with other people, hence people talking about it. And other people also can present new forms and patterns. And your own soul, your own best possibilities, sometimes speaks through other people in the most gentlest of ways. Or sometimes, if not gently, in the sense of the gentle meaning. I'm not talking about the tone of voice necessarily, but of course a gentle tone is very, very nice. But the meaning is gentle. And if it's not gentle, then it is at least clear to a high degree. And that relationship between oneself, the soul, and other people is also around an artistic trance, a reservoir of pure possibilities, like a well of space that is beaming with twilight of existence, coming in and out of possibilities. And the artistic trance is to focus in and hone and gaze and let possibilities simply manifest, like looking into a crystal or looking into a dark space, an abyss of sorts that is actually alive and speaking. And there can fish out possibilities and interact in order to create good things. For yourself, for colleagues, friends, society. New forms arise, and just as these people who do this kind of work, pursuit, life. They present culture and society with new forms, these new ideas, just as destiny or destinies or the soul presented to the individuals, well, individuals present it to culture. And the culture can decide whether or not it wants to, if it's in its own best interest. Is it? If it's in the best interest of an individual, and sometimes your own soul speaks through other people, then why wouldn't it be the case for individuals in the culture? Of course it could be. And those individuals then go to propagate those ideas in their own way, whether music, politics, math, science, fiction, dance, or just walking in a park, blithely looking at squirrels, or whatever animals there are there, birds. So two other individuals in that park will pick off the fruits of the experience that that person is having without that person even knowing it. And that too is culture, which takes on its own form because that individual that picked off and enjoyed the experience of that person is going to go write his own book or is going to go write his own song. And then people are going to hear that and say, there is something about that song that calls to me.